For 21 suns the snow did not stop speaking, and everything it said was the same word. No. It hissed down the spine of the bleeding mountains, filled ravines until they forgot their names, blew from ridge to ridge like powdered bone. The white glare turned noon into a kind of darkness. Below that merciless weather, the dragons stayed. They had been called ravenous, rightly, for the way their pale bodies scissored through cloud banks and their hunger burned villages empty in a single pass. But hunger had found its master here. The den's cradle, once a shallow saucer scraped into black basalt, had become a mouth plugged by a slab of avalanche stone, and the pack that devoured armies spent its days motionless, listening for a sound that refused to return. They had clawed until sparks leapt. They had rammed until ribs hummed. They had leaned their immense weight into the slab the way a tide leans into a seawall, and gotten the same answer. Not you. The matriarch held the line between despair and the ruin that comes after. She was snowlight and scars, a cathedral of muscle folded into stillness, horn-ridged nick-like punctuation over one luminescent eye. She stood at the gate every morning the storm would allow, and pressed her skull to stone, harvesting any tremor as if a heartbeat might be tucked between layers of granite and ice. When the mountain offered only its own slow mineral pulse, she drew back and let the pack breathe again. That was the rhythm now. Test the world. Refuse its answer. Endure. Even grief needed tending. The elders warmed the air with fire kept deliberately shy, a thin blue living on old soot lines that traced generations of winters. Yearlings carried melt in bowls smoothed by centuries of tongues and poured it in a ring around the cradle lip, a ritual against the cruelty of cold. Hunters returned thin, having flown past the herds without diving, as if to break the hunt would be to admit the den's emptiness aloud. When the wind died enough to make room for a voice, they sang. Not the kill song that sharpens claws, but the low note that undergirds nest talk and needs no language. Here, here, here. Outside, the mountain rehearsed collapse in small pieces. The creak of new cornice, the hollow percussion of snow settling over old. Once, at the edge of storm, a drone ventured into the gorge and hesitated at the mouth of that heat-dark opening. The sentry lifted her head and blew a short, contemptuous breath that flipped the machine end over end and sent it pinwheeling away with its red eye blinking an apology no one would hear. The world did not belong to observers today. On the 17th sun, a scent threaded the gale that made every head lift at once. Not prey, not rival, not the metallic static of machines. It was the faint sweetness of wet shell and the sharp, new milk tang of hatchling scale, a ghost of it. A memory with weight. The pack rippled from chin on stone to ready without crossing the line into madness. The matriarch moved last. She stepped to the lip, violet eye narrowed against the swirl of white, and tasted the air again, with mouth slightly open, tongue curled to carry the fragrance to ancient vaults behind her palate. It was there. It was far. It was impossible. A note started in her chest that could have turned rock to shrapnel if she'd let it grow. She throttled it down to a thread and sent it along the ceiling of the den, a command and a prayer braided tightly together. Hold. She backed away from the cradle and lay with her throat along the floor, at the pose of a queen making herself an offering. Around her, the pack arranged their bodies the way furniture arranges itself in a room that has remembered what it's for. Paths clear, heat pooled, eyes on the mouth of the world. If the mountain meant to give them back nothing, they would give it patience. If the mountain meant to test them, they would pass by refusing to break. The storm ratcheted its jaw and ground down on the ridges. The dragons did not blink. Somewhere below the rack light, a man was climbing, though none of them knew his name. And the only proof of him yet was the adrenaline singing in the matriarch's blood and the fragile, impossible smell of lives not done breathing. He'd told himself he was finished with rescues. Nyrixia had a way of laughing at vows. Ronan Vex took the last switchback by force of habit and will, the two tools he had refused to let the world take. The wind had been trying to sit him down for hours. He kept standing out of spite. Crust snow broke to his knees, then his thighs, then, insultingly, held just long enough to convince him it had learned manners before shattering again. His exothermal suit had given up pretending to be new 2 winters ago. It worked because it knew he would, and because he had fed it parts from machines that would never fly again. He'd found the first shell shard 3 kilometers downslope, glossy as a fish scale in a world of matte white. He'd found the second by smell, a stain of iron in snow, crushed thin by something heavy and frantic. He'd found the third by sound, the faintest scrape under the avalanche's smooth lie, a noise that would have disappeared if the wind had taken a deeper breath. He had cut, then dug, then tunneled, greedily careful, until his hands were theater props for a man made of frost and blood. And then the smallest of them had moved against his wrist with a furious, fragile insistence that rearranged the map of the day. Hatchlings don't understand compromise. They know warm and they know gone. He had wrapped them against his chest in the thermal web, fed them the gray-tinged oxygen of a nanoampule, swabbed life into their gums with sugar paste and a lie about the taste of summer. His ribs were a cage for 5 monarchs who wanted the old familiar heart behind a pale throat, and he was not going to be the one to explain disappointment. So he climbed. The gorge's mouth appeared as a darker darkness, the black lip of basalt rhyming over with ice where dragon breath had met storm and lost. Sentinels were shapes at first, then they were details, the fine, frost-limbed filigree along horn edges, the shallow, lethal crescents their talons had carved into the stone over 100 patient nights, the faint pulse in the throat where scale gave way to softer armor. Ronan's legs betrayed him at the sight, not out of fear, but out of the ordinary treachery of muscle deprived of rest. He went to one knee, and the web shifted, and 5 small lives told the air they were not dead yet. That sound changed the room. The nearest sentinel's head dipped, a fraction. Not submission. Recalibration. Heat poured out of the den in a slow, deliberate tide that fought the storm to a draw 2 meters from the threshold. Ronan did the only thing his body trusted him to do anymore. He showed his hands, fingers splayed, palms open, then pressed both palms back against the web as if to say, "I am not here to bargain. I am here to carry." He took the first step onto the rock lip and felt the difference at once. The world tilting under him from treacherous to merely unforgiving. The snow lost interest in him. The heat found greed. His face stung as feeling reclaimed territory from numbness. He looked up because looking down would have meant quitting, and quitting had been a hobby he'd already burned through. The den's vault bloomed out of the dark. Ledges climbed its walls like the ribs of a great animal. Frost glittered where old steam had made lace of the ceiling and then gone to sleep there. The air was a liturgy of mineral, ash, musk, milk. She came into view not like a threat, but like a verdict. The matriarch stepped to the fore, each placement of her foreclaws an argument that stone accepted. The ridge over her left eye bore a notch you could have hidden a coin in. Her scales threw back the den fire in 1,000 soft shards. She lowered until the lamp of one eye filled his horizon, and the hard shadow of her horn fell across the web where 5 faces had begun to press, blind with hunger and hope, into the shape of a future. She breathed across him, a forge door opening. Hair crisped, eyebrows sang. The thermal web groaned as its fibers considered the difference between useful and fatal heat, and chose useful because he had. Ronan kept his gaze on the hinge where horn rooted into skull. Meeting a predator's pupil is a way to turn mercy off by accident. He wasn't here to test her mercy. He was here to be the proof of it. He knelt very carefully and eased the bundle toward the floor. One hatchling had a claw hooked in the mesh. He teased it free with his thumb and winced when a needle tooth found the seam in his glove and pinched hard as if notarizing a contract. The smallest hiccuped. He tore an ampule with his teeth, fogged their faces with oxygen, then tucked the web tighter to keep the new air from stealing their heat as it left. The pack pressed closer in a choreography that had learned the difference between many and too many a long time ago. Bodies leaned, then stopped. Wings flared, then tucked again. A young male quivered as if his muscles had forgotten what stillness was for, and a single side eye from the matriarch reminded him. The den's breath, 100 lungs and a fire, lifted and lowered in a rhythm older than calendars. It asked him a question without words. He answered by staying. He pressed the heel of his bad hand against the web's seam and let the smarting in his palm anchor him to the moment. He bent until the hatchlings could hear his voice through the thick slot of their ear frills, and he said something stupid and exacting and true in a rasp the storm hadn't quite erased. "You're home." The matriarch's throat thrummed once, a low acknowledgement that traveled through stone into the old sleeping heat below. Behind Ronan, the wind lunged at the mouth of the den and met a line it could not cross. Ahead of him, 5 fragile bodies learned the taste of the air that had made them. He did not lower his head to beg. He did not lift his chin to dare. He took one breath, then another, then a third, because the den had found a new interval, and he intended to keep it. Heat layered the cavern in slow sheets, folding over Ronan's face and turning the ice in his beard to damp threads that clung to his jaw. The pack arranged itself along ledges and ribs of basalt until the walls looked alive with pale constellations. Every sound carried twice, once to his ears and once into the stone, which answered with a low old echo that made the den feel ribbed with breath. The first roar came like a landslide of voice, enough to make dust jump in rings along the floor. It should have smashed him flat and rattled the hatchlings into silence. Instead, the roar curved, diminishing as it traveled, as if the cavern itself ate most of the violence and left the marrow of the message behind. "We see you." He eased the thermal web to the floor one handspan at a time, refusing to let the heat trapped within spill out recklessly. Tiny bodies rolled and reassembled into a single stubborn knot, heads nuzzling blindly toward the direction the air tasted like mother. The nearest dragon, her muzzle feathered with frost, stretched her neck until her nostrils hovered a breath above the web. Steam feathered from the fibers. The smallest hatchling hiccuped, offended that breath could be both familiar and not, and jabbed its snout through the mesh so decisively that a tooth caught on a thread. Ronan freed it with his thumb, enduring a ceremonial nip that felt like a signature burned into glove and skin. The matriarch's shadow broke over him like an eclipse. Up close, she was a geography lesson. Plates overlaying like glaciers, scars mapping a history that had nothing to do with humans and everything to do with winters and wars that did not make the archives. She tasted the air with her mouth slightly open, tongue cupped to lift scent to hidden organs, then breathed across the bundle in a wash that could have melted solder. The thermal web thrummed, flexed, held. Ronan kept his gaze on the hinge where horn rooted to skull. He had no interest in the etiquette of challenge. He wanted only the etiquette of keeping. Behind the matriarch, yearlings held poses so tense their flanks trembled. One started forward without meaning to, pulled by the ridiculous magnetism of the small. The matriarch did not lower a claw or widen an eye. She set the tip of her tail down hard enough to lift a halo of dust at the impulsive one's paws. The ring of powder hung, perfect, then drifted back to earth as the yearling recalibrated himself into patience, a heartbeat too late to pretend it had been his idea all along. Ronan worked, because work was what kept breath traveling the distance it needed to travel. He slid a patch of slow heat under the chill belly of the weakest, counted the heartbeats that answered, uncertain at first, then steadier, and fed a mist of oxygen past needle teeth, pulling the web closed fast so the new air wouldn't steal the old warmth on its way out. He spoke without thinking, the tone more important than the syllables. A medic learns quickly that voice is another kind of bandage. The den borrowed his rhythm. The pack's collective breath slid into time with his, a large engine easing its pistons into a smaller machine's tempo. The walls wrote back their own music, water ticking somewhere far inside rock, the slow displacement of heat around the cradle, the faint rasp of scale on stone when a dragon shifted weight by a fraction to keep a draft off the web. The matriarch sank lower until one luminous eye filled Ronan's peripheral vision, a pale planet with a pupil like a moonless sea. He did not look directly into it. He watched the maddeningly tender place where scale met skin along the edge of her jaw and said to the bundle and to the queen and to his hands, "Stay with me." One hatchling's wingbud had dried wrong. The thin skin folded where it should have stretched. He warmed his fingers against his own neck and teased the membrane open with a patience that felt like prayer. The wing unfurled a millimeter at a time, slick and opalescent, then trembled on its own and gave a soft, triumphant shiver. Ronan laughed once, a sound too sharp to be joy and too gentle to be anything else, and the sound came back from the ceiling wrapped in approving stone. A murmur swam through the gathered bodies, not quite voice, a current of relief that did not require grammar. The oldest male in the back, his muzzle scarred into a permanent frown, exhaled a groan of satisfaction so theatrical it nearly broke the spell into laughter. The yearling's shoulders shook, and then, shamed by their own amusement, stilled again. The matriarch inclined her head a fraction, not toward Ronan but toward the web, and breathed a different kind of warmth. Humid, thick, a summer laid tenderly on cloth. Beyond the mouth of the cavern, the storm pulled off its mask and sulked down valley. Pale light reached in without audacity and found nothing to argue with. Inside, the pack began to arrange itself into a new architecture. Wings angled to spoil drafts without starving the fire. Tails coiled where they would not trip a human with a tired knee. A shallow bowl, carved and polished by tons in an age when the den was wetter, appeared beside the web. A dragon with a notch missing from her tail dipped her horn into melt, pooled under a rock lip, and dripped a patient, precise rain until the bowl held enough. Ronan dimly realized someone had anticipated him needing water and had fetched the tool that made that possible. He reached for the bowl and realized his hands were shaking. Before he could feel embarrassed, a foreclaw slid forward until it pressed lightly against his shoulder blades and found the exact pressure that would steady a body without caging it. He leaned into the promise because it would have been rude not to. A single tone, low and round as a drumskin tapped with a palm, rose from an unseen throat and hung in the air. It was answered by another, a third, until the cavern hummed at a frequency that seemed to take up residence in Ronan's sternum and teach his ribs a new flexibility. The hatchlings quieted into sleep as if lulled by the vibration, their tiny claws flexing and releasing against mesh and fur and his sleeve. The pack's hum gentled down to a purr you could mistake for silence if you hadn't just heard how loud the world can be. He could have slept then, could have trusted stone and scale to hold everything he had dared to carry. Instead, he sat with his spine fitted to the curve of the foreclaw behind him and watched the matriarch watch her future breathe. The den, which had felt like a wound the mountain refused to close, took on the geometry of a room again. It had a center. It remembered what belonged there. It had decided not to kill. The ritual announced itself without horns or drums. The matriarch stood, drew herself into a shape that required the eye to step back, and crossed to the black shelf of volcanic glass that served as the den's ledger. Pale scratches scarred its face. Broad cuts for winters, rings for clutches, notches in clusters for hunts told and retold. She touched her horn to the glass and dragged a line in one slow stroke. The mark smoked, then cooled. A new curve nested inside an older one, with 5 short rises beneath. No dragon spoke. There were languages that moved too slowly for that. She returned to the cradle and breathed. The thin blue along old soot woke obediently, ran the shallow channels like rivulets finding the long-remembered riverbed, and climbed to gold where ash still remembered fat. Heat lapped against the web's underside. Moisture gathered and slid away down grooves carved for it in an age when someone else had needed the same mercy. The pack shifted into a ring that managed to be both respectful and practical. The elders took the high stone, the young found shadows where their excitement could be contained by older ribs. The matriarch looked at Ronan and asked the question the den had been saving for him. She did not speak aloud. She lifted one claw and drew its tip along the seam of the web until the fibers darkened with a kiss of scorch, then touched her horn to his sternum and held it there. An ache, a promise, a demand. Put them down. Trust us. Trust yourself to let go. He had invented 1,000 reasons to hold on in the years since he quit rescuing as a profession and kept doing it as a reflex. Letting go had never been one. He slid his hands under the web, felt the weight of 5 futures, and set the bundle into the cradle as carefully as if the world were a tray of thin glass. Heat pooled around the edges. The hatchlings fussed at the change in pressure, at the treachery of gravity. He tucked a corner, smoothed a wrinkle, gave up the fantasy of control and replaced it with supervision. He stepped back exactly as far as the matriarch's tail allowed and stopped because a ceremony needed distance to complete its geometry. A hiccup in the rhythm ruined the lines. One of the tiny chests paused too long between rises. Ronan felt it before he saw it. The pack did not move. The matriarch's eye tilted. He was already there, lifting the limp fraction of weight into his palms, turning it belly down along his fingers so its throat lay in the groove between thumb and forefinger. He gave 2 measured taps between the shoulder blades with a nail, tilted, swept the airway with the edge of his smallest finger, gentle, clean, and brought the oxygen ampule to its muzzle. Nothing. He covered snout and mouth with his lips and breathed once, twice, counting silently, hearing in his bones the old metronome of fieldwork. In 2-3, out 2-3. The den's hum rose to a pitch that made dust uncurl from the ceiling. The matriarch laid her jaw on the cradle's rim next to his wrist and exhaled a second rhythm across his hands, slow, deliberate, a large heart volunteering to be a model for a smaller one. The pack held still with a heroism that would never make a story anywhere but here. The hatchling's ribcage jerked, then seized the beat and rode it, outraged to find itself briefly on the wrong side of the line. Its mouth opened in a wail so thin and pure it made the glass shelf sing an octave higher down the wall. Ronan laughed, an involuntary burst that hurt his nose and soothed something greedy in the den. He slid the hatchling back under the web and pressed 2 fingers where heart met ribs, waiting for the gallop to sort itself into a canter. The count came right. He set his hand down on the cradle's lip because it needed a place to pour the leftover adrenaline. The stone was warm. He had not realized how much he missed that simple fact. The matriarch inclined her head until the bony ridge above her eye pressed gently into his shoulder. Not a shove, a benediction. When she lifted away, a dot of ash smudged the fabric there. It would not wash out. He had the sudden, insane thought that he would be furious if it did. The pack broke formation in increments, a ring relaxing. Someone nosed a cleaned bone into place to prop the web so air could move without stealing heat. Someone else dragged the old melt bowl closer, and a different dragon rained a patient drip from her horn tip into it until the surface trembled with enough. A youngster, overcome by the desire to be helpful and off by a beat, tried to bring a glowing coal and was gently, precisely redirected by an elder's tail into fetching charred bark instead, which, wonder of wonders, actually mattered. Ronan found himself grinning at a world where even mistakes could be repurposed into usefulness. From outside, faint and astonished, came the whir of a drone trying to teach itself courtesy. It hovered at the threshold. Len's iris narrowed down to a respectful pinhole. Ronan didn't signal, he didn't need to. The matriarch lifted her head and breathed a single, soft puff. The drone backed away as if pulled on a string by an invisible hand that had decided to spare it a lecture. Somewhere far below, a pilot exhaled and discovered she had been holding her breath for a very long minute. Ronan leaned against the pillar that anchored the cradle and let fatigue creep down his limbs like a tide finally permitted in. The old vow uncurled in his chest. First the one he'd learned under a buzzing light, do no harm. Then the one he had grimly added in alleys and on cracked roads, do what you can. Then, as the hum of dragons rebuilt a floor under him, a third clause that felt less like an oath and more like an admission of the job he had somehow won. Keep what you can carry, and when it is time, carry what keeps you. The den's temperature settled into a long, generous interval that made his bones forgive him. He watched the matriarch lower her throat until it touched the edge of the web, and 5 pale muzzles climbed the ramp of her jaw with the helpless entitlement of the new. He watched a hatchling the color of frost-bitten moonlight plant both forepaws on his wrist, claim it as terrain, and fall asleep standing there, head pillowed on his pulse. He watched the yearlings practice not staring at him and fail sweetly. He listened while elders rethreaded an old song around a brand new verse. When sleep overtook him, it did not shove. It invited. He slid down until the curve of a claw held his shoulder blades and the cradle's heat teased his shins, and the hum of dragons nested under his heart. The last thing he saw before his eyes closed was the ledger on the black glass, the new mark cooling into permanence. The last thing he heard was a breath that did not belong to him stake a claim to the room. The last thing he felt was the mountain, deciding to be kind, hold still. The first true morning after the ledger mark did not arrive with trumpets. It came as a practical list the den wrote for itself. Keep the cradle warm. Keep the air moving. Keep the foolish from tripping over their own love. The matriarch stretched into a curve that made a wall out of muscle without stealing space. Elders took the high stone and learned how to nap with one eye awake. Yearlings discovered that the most difficult command in any language is wait. Ronan woke with the ache of a man whose body had been negotiated with by mountain, cold, and responsibility, and found a small dragon asleep on his forearm like a gauntlet. Another had collapsed across his shin as if claiming rights by weight. He lay a minute, listening to the den hum, a low, steady music that made his heart behave, and then set about being useful. He turned 2 chunks of basalt into heat sinks by sliding them beneath the thermal web so the cradle's breath wouldn't spike and fall. He taught a dragon with a notched tail how to carry melt in the shallow bowl without spilling. Tilt the horn, let the water fall in a steady thread. Count 4 beats, breathe, repeat. He ran his hand along a side vent and felt the shape of the draft with his palm, then lodged a pumice stone at the mouth. The air began to turn in a soft loop, the kind of circulation you don't notice because nothing dramatic happens when a room is exactly the temperature needed. Outside, the mountain put its violence away like a weapon returned to a rack. The wind still threaded the gorge, but it had lost the habit of knives. Footprints appeared on the far rim, tiny as punctuation at this height, paused, then retreated. The pack felt the watcher and did not bother to bristle. You only raise your hackles when you need to write large. The den had learned to speak quietly. When the first human shapes reached the shelf, a squad of search and rescue with their hands empty and their helmets unlatched, the matriarch rose with a slowness that looked like ceremony and placed herself between the cradle and the threshold. Ronan didn't wave them in, didn't send them away. He stood where he was and let the moment decide its own size. The team lead took off his gloves. He showed his fingers to the den, a language older than their training. "We brought nothing you don't leave with," he said, voice pitched low, as if the stone were an auditor of tone. He set a coil of thermal blanket and a stack of sealed med patches on the rock just outside the line of the matriarch's shadow. He nodded to Ronan in the respectful, ridiculous way men nod to one another when they do not know who is in charge and have decided it should not matter. "We'll be down valley if you need us." They left a beacon under a flat stone a dozen paces along the path, its pulse invisible unless you knew where to look, then made themselves smaller on the trail until the snow ate their sounds. The room kept breathing. The hatchlings, who had spent the last hour proving that sleep can be performed with all 4 feet pointing in different directions, continued to do so with a vindictive zeal that made the yearlings' legs itch to run. Work found them. A fever burned briefly in the smallest, hotter than the cradle, bright as a bad idea. Ronan pulled the little body against his chest and cooled with melt on the back of his knuckles, and a current of air teased from the matriarch's mouth, a breath she pared down to mercy. He spoke low and steady until the too fast count behind his fingers slowed and the heat puddled away under his palm. The pack's hum climbed a half step and settled again, a chorus pretending not to worry. Other problems were simpler, generous in their willingness to be solved. A wing bud stuck and came free under 2 warm fingertips. A claw snagged the web and learned the cost of impatience. The matriarch corrected a yearling with a tap that left no mark and a look that promised memory. Someone dragged the fire closer and was persuaded by an elder's tail to drag it back the width of 1 forepaw. A bowl of melt needed moving. A scarred male did it with such exaggerated care, the den nearly laughed. Ronan found himself grinning at a room where mistakes could be bent gently into competence and no one kept a ledger of embarrassment. By late light, the gorge grew spectators. Not close, on the far rim where the wind writes its edicts. Miners off shift, a ranger who had been told once too often that work is a wall against the world, a child standing between 2 adults with a hand in each of theirs. They did not shout or point. They watched the den glow a color no weather produces and left a parcel on the trail. A knitted cap, absurdly blue with a pom-pom. The yearlings found it later and revered it with a focus that, for once, did no harm. Night swam in on the ceiling. The matriarch walked to the black ledger shelf and pressed her horn into the mark she had made earlier until it gleamed again, not to add to it but to name it permanent. The pack gathered, not for spectacle but for inventory. 5 small breaths. 5 heads counted like stars you've worried you invented. A human who had the good sense to accept a foreclaw at his spine like a brace. The den hummed a lullaby that didn't need words. Stay, stay, stay. Ronan slept with his cheek against the warm seam where scale turns to skin, and did not wake to any bad news. The mountain kept its side of that bargain. Dawn did the ordinary miracle of light through steam. It broke itself on the matriarch's horns, walked down her spine and plates, and pooled in the cradle as a pale shine. The hatchlings woke with the chaotic agreement of the young, one yawn setting off another, a lurch mistaken for a leap, a squeak that pretended to be a roar and convinced nobody. They learned, within the hour, that a human sleeve can be a hill and a human hand the proper response when you reach the top. Work broadened its scope. Scouts lifted into the gorge, skimming the cold like skaters, and returned with plain news that sounded like relief because it was. The northern cornice had let go without burying anything important. The river had found its surface again in one skinny place. A herd 2 valleys over had not moved in weather that would have justified it. The pack, once a cyclone of appetites, began to look like a household that had found a schedule. Ronan went down the mountain because supplies do not walk uphill on their own. The pack walked him to the shelf. The yearlings behaved, then forgot, then behaved harder. At the lip, the matriarch leaned until her brow bumped his shoulder in a touch so precise it felt like the signing of a document no lawyer would ever see. He touched the ridge where scale turned tender under his palm and let his hand stay there long enough that the heat sank through bone into a place he had kept cold on purpose for years. On the lower trail, people made a lane without being asked. A ranger had hung a hand-painted sign where the wind could read it. No weapons beyond this point. It flapped and nodded, as if even the air had agreed to try. Ronan fixed a relay at the outpost because relays never survive good weather, spent one night in a bed that did not smell like basalt, and found himself at 3 a.m. staring at a screen that would not stop replaying his silhouette crossing the den with the bundle. The angle had caught something he couldn't have. The angle of the matriarch's head when she made space for him. The exact geometry of a room deciding to admit a new kind of body. He climbed back at first light. The hatchlings had grown into new faces in 2 days, a trick babies everywhere perform to keep you surprised enough to stay. One barreled into his knee with the zeal of a bad plan and demanded the old scratch at the ridge where horn would bud. He obliged, surrounded by elders pretending not to supervise. The pom-pom had been shredded into a liturgy and redistributed among the bedding. The yearlings were more restful as a result, though none would admit causation. The world readjusted. The outpost stopped answering calls with protocol and started answering with names. Streams of footage were quietly left alone. Humans began to come up the switchbacks not to claim a view but to practice a kind of listening. A city can't teach. They set parcels on the rock and went away without waiting to be thanked. A coil of wool, a pouch of salt, a child's drawing of 5 white ovals, and 1 upright stick figure under an enormous, sincere sun. The matriarch sniffed each offering and ignored all of them. The offerings were for the mountain, and the mountain liked being included. Hunting resumed. Not as spectacle, not as contrition, simply because bodies that grow need what they need. The pack went out lean and came back precisely fed. They left a rib at the den mouth for old reasons and flew a wide circle above the lower trail for new ones. A buzzard tested the line and found itself escorted a kilometer down valley by a youth with more enthusiasm than tact. The lesson held. On a day with a sky the color of clean steel, the hatchlings found their legs belonged to the air. It happened not with a leap, but with a series of mistakes. A hop, a skid, a flail that accidentally became lift for exactly the distance between Ronan and the matriarch's foreclaw. The den applauded by pretending not to watch. The matriarch pretended not to be proud and failed. Ronan laughed until his ribs reminded him of recent arrangements and then laughed more quietly. The smallest, having mastered the art of falling safely, climbed the length of his arm and made a bold, wobbly glide from his shoulder to the cradle, landing in a sideways sprawl that would one day be grace. It lay there, stunned by its own audacity, then looked back at him with eyes that had figured out that fear and joy are neighbors. Far away in rooms where signatures have more weight than weather, words took on new meanings. Preserve stopped sounding like storage and started sounding like habit. Sanctuary lost its capital letter and snuck into daily speech. A memo about extraction permits failed to reach the end of its sentence. Nobody had voted yet. The mountain had, and for once the administrative world seemed inclined to follow rather than pretend it had led. When night came early and the sky hung its green curtains close enough to touch, the pack sang. The song had the iron in it that keeps families fed and the sweetness that keeps them together. It braided around Ronan's ribs and lengthened his breath and asked him nothing he could not give. The matriarch stepped behind him and lowered her horn until it lay along his shoulder and left it there. Not a brand, not ownership. A steadying weight that said, "We are shared out now, none of us alone are the story." He thought, very briefly and without the old panic, of the life he had abandoned to come here. He let it pass through him like cold air through a warm room and felt it leave without taking anything he'd need tomorrow. The den dimmed to embers. 5 pale shapes settled into a heap against the place where her throat joined her chest. A yearling sprawled and snored like a saw, milling the quiet into thinner quiet. The old male cleared his throat in sleep, as if still negotiating a critical point. The hum lowered until the mountain could carry it unaided. In the morning, there would be more work. A vent to check, a need to mind, a bowl to fill, a sign down trail whose letters would need repainting after the next squall. In the morning, the world would arrive with its usual list of small catastrophes and be handled by hands that had learned where to put warmth and where to leave space. Tonight, the den kept what it had decided to keep. The sky, having watched enough to remember its manners, stood still. Ronan slept with his palm open on the cradle's rim and woke, several hours later, to the specific weight of a small head pressed into that hand, trusting the heat there to remain. He did not move until the pressure shifted on its own. Outside, the wind read the sign again, nodded, and went to bother a different mountain. Inside, the pack breathed, and the world, insofar as it could be persuaded, agreed to keep time.